Neurodiversity can be defined as the idea that people have different interpretations and experiences of the world that manifest in their thinking and behavior. Recent evidence suggests that queer people tend to identify as neurodivergent. For a number of reasons, queer people may have experiences that can be associated with being neurodivergent, such as having one's psychological safety affected by being highly alert to microaggressions, or feeling physical sensitivity in the case when gender-diverse people wear chest binders or tucking underwear that can impact their sense of body awareness. Having an awareness of how neurodiversity can appear across the spectrum of queer people matters for considerations of proper treatment of this population in healthcare. Unfortunately, autistic queer people have reported having their autism confused for their gender identity or sexuality, even being confabulated as causal for the other. While autistic persons do not encompass every person who is neurodivergent, these reports reveal the harm that can occur in our healthcare system when we neglect to acknowledge the diversity that exists within queerness, already a widely encompassing term itself. Neuroqueering introduces the concept that queerness and neurodivergence can coexist. The framework acknowledges an intersection of identities that means they are informed but not caused by one another. Understanding what neuroqueering is and why neurodivergence and queerness should be affirmed as identities and not diseases impacting people means the difference between compassion versus neglect towards this community. We are better for recognizing the strengths that being neuroqueer can bring to one's own mental, physical, and emotional health, instead of exacerbating existing health disparities for queer people. The person known for sharing this idea openly with their listeners, clients, and supporters, Pasha Marlowe, joins us today as we discuss embracing neurodivergence within the queer community. Hello, everybody. Super excited to talk on this Pride Month Saturday to also introduce Pasha Marlowe, who is our guest for today. And I am going to introduce the topic. Today, we're going to be talking about neurodiversity, queerness, the intersection of those, being neuroqueering or neuroqueer. And we're going to have one of the experts on that with us. And I'm so excited that she has offered her time to educate and to enlighten. So without further ado, I will read your bio, Pasha. So Pasha Marlowe brings 30 years of professional experience as a mental health professional and coach for neurodivergent adults. She speaks on virtual and live global stages on issues of neurodiversity, disability inclusion, and LGBTQIA plus advocacy. She also brings 53 years of lived experience as a multiply neurodivergent, disabled, and queer person. Pasha's keynotes and workshops are uniquely relatable, inclusive, compassionate, and always include large doses of humor so as to entertain while educating and inspiring. She works with individuals, couples, organizations, and schools who want to focus on strengths more than deficits and celebrate a diversity of minds and bodies. She supports collaboration to get to the root of your problems, create new patterns of interaction, and make change quickly. And she is here with us today. Welcome to the Queerity Podcast, Pasha.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. Excited for this conversation.
Super excited. And if you're watching on video, I have to say, Pasha, I love this background you have. It's very colorful.
Very queer, right? Yeah, it's a rainbow. For those that can't see, it's a rainbow brick wall, kind of splattered, almost graffiti style rainbow paint. So to me, it means like, there's messages in the mess, and there's beauty, and there's in the sometimes hardships. Life is brutal, brutal and beautiful all at the same time. That's what it means to me.
Certainly beautiful.
Right.
I like that combination. And I am going to begin with talking more about your background because I am interested in how you even started with your career. You have a background in mental health, an aspect of health that many sexual and gender minoritized individuals struggle with or have to prioritize. And how did you get started in therapy and specifically wanting to incorporate care for the queer community? Did one come before the other? Did it kind of start around the same time?
Always from childhood, I certainly knew I was an ally, at least, to the queer community. And then over time, recognized myself as in the community. So I always knew I wanted
Mhm,
to be of service to the queer community. I also, from childhood, knew I wanted to be a helper or a healer. And back in the 80s, the path was psychology and becoming a therapist. So in the mid 90s, I got my graduate degree in marriage and family therapy and thought for
mhm,
sure that I would want to be marriage and family therapist in private practice. Unfortunately, back in the day, it wasn't as holistic of a field, nor was it as
mhm.
inclusive and as progressive as it is now. There's still lots of work to be done. But I left because I didn't resonate with the strong pathology paradigm that I had to work under in diagnosing people in a certain way as disordered. And I just never resonated with that strong pathology paradigm. So,
Right.
so I, um, I left the field briefly and went into holistic healthcare, including yoga and fitness and mindfulness, but still dabbled in coaching and then translated all that into my combination of work now with neurodivergent and queer people.
Alrighty. And what you just detailed really is a path that was winding, right? You didn't just continue in one thing. You said, oh, I'm not a fan of the
Mhm.
diagnosing and the pathologizing, which is someone else in healthcare. We do quite often, as you
Mhm.
know, and the stigma that can result from that for the community, very
Mhm.
troubling to deal with. But going forward with your yoga and fitness and then reinventing yourself into a coach and consultant, I'm sure that
Mhm.
that twist of turns has been really fruitful for you. And I'm excited that you're on this journey. So, given terms like neuroqueer and
Mhm.
neurodiverse have most recently come into popular usage, and if they've been used actually for longer, please let me know. But when you first started, did you notice gaps in the treatment of these individuals? Like, did you notice any similarities between people that kind of like would even combine into that word? And is that kind of how you became passionate to even address this topic?
Yes, as many people in my field, we realized our neurodivergence, but didn't have language for it before neurodivergent as a word didn't come out till I believe it was the early 2000s. Neurodiversity as a word wasn't popularized until late 1990s. So it is a quite new
Mm,
term, new language. Neuroqueer, I only learned about in the last 5 years as a term. But all that to be said, all
mhm,
along, I knew that I was not society's idea of normal or typical. I also knew that my father didn't present that way, nor did my
mhm,
children. So I always had a sense that there was a language that was missing from the conversation because what we were
mhm.
diagnosed as is abnormal or disordered or deficient or mentally ill. And all of those are quite pathologizing and not strength based. And so I
Right.
think the gap for me came in the language of it because now the neurodivergent identity is for anyone who diverges from society's idea of what is the normal, right, ideal way to be. Because
Mhm,
neurodivergent is an identity, not a diagnosis. So even just having that
mhm.
word helped fill in the gap a little bit for me.
Yeah, certainly. The language, that part,
Well,
right?
yeah.
That part that we contribute to with literature when describing populations, when populations read public health campaigns or read any invitation to an event and want to feel included, that language that we use, how do we consider the experiences and the thoughts and feelings of the people who we want to be a part of our vet or our community or the medical system, which
Mhm.
we focus here on because there are so many health disparities that are going
Yes.
on impacting the community. And so I think it's wonderful that these terms are becoming more into use. And like you said, I mean, you just learned neuroqueer 5 years ago or even used it as a term, but you've been practicing with these individuals for a while. And it's just knowing what to call it. So,
Yes. And having, I think, more empowering strength based terms and words for it. And so I love the way
yeah.
language is I mean, even queer as a term itself is recently
Yeah.
reclaimed, So I think language changes. And as it changes, in some ways, it becomes more accepting and empowering. So, yeah.
Yes, yes. And are there some agreed upon typical signs of neurodiversity that people can recognize? Or is this a phenomenon that varies from person to person and we can't really speak on anything that's agreed upon?
Good question. So, neurodiversity is the diversity of all minds and all nervous systems. So, our entire human
Okay.
species is neurodiverse. Some of us are neurodivergent, some of us are neurotypical, some of us don't identify as either, but everyone as a human as a human species rather, is neurodiverse. So,
Oh,
neurodiverse.
thank you.
Yeah, and it's a again, I live and breathe this language, so but that's a common misperception that neurodiversity means neurodivergent. It's also a common misperception that neurodivergent means only ADHD and autism, or maybe ADHD, autism, dyslexia, but
Mm-hmm.
neurodivergent is an umbrella that encompasses everything in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, that is like all disorders, anything that
Yeah,
diverges from neuronormativity. So it could be traumatic brain injury, epilepsy, trauma. So there's so much under that umbrella. So in terms of some
yeah,
commonalities, that's a little tricky because it's so vast. But the commonality, I would say, is people rejecting the label of disorder, people rejecting the idea that there is one normal or right way to be. And so anyone who identifies as neurodivergent is saying, you might have diagnosed me as bipolar disorder or autism spectrum disorder, but I'm rejecting that disordered language. And I'm saying I'm different for sure. And I like being different, but let's drop
right.
the order and let's celebrate and honor our differences and our lived experiences. And that's not to say that we don't have challenges, we do, but let's not magnify disorder, deficiency, dysphoria. I'm forgetting another D word. They're all the D words seem quite negative.
Yeah,
But yeah.
they need to go on an X list.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of empowering words start with A and a lot of pathologizing words start with D. Just in general, that seems to be coming to my awareness. But nonetheless, I'm sure there's lovely words that start with D as well, like dreaming. And I dream of a world where there's less pathology and stigma.
Yay. I thank you for adding to the knowledge base that now I have, but also people listening in or watching will have, in that we are all neurodiverse. That is such a truth. I
Yeah.
mean, how could we not be, right? Everybody's coming from different experiences and have different feelings and thoughts to contribute. Like, it's observable in conversation. So that's evident for sure. And you are not new to explaining these topics on the podcast platform. I actually listened to an episode or two of your podcast, specifically the ones where you talked about neuroqueering and neuroqueer. And shout out to the neuroqueering podcast, Beyond the Intersection of Neurodiversity and Queerness.
Thank you.
I remember listening in where you explained that neuroqueer can be an identity and a verb. I also
Mhm.
like that you mention, and you continue to mention, the depathologization. I can't believe I said that fast.
That was good.
The depathologization of language and removing stigma from the neurodivergent and queer communities. And you mentioned something in particular. You mentioned that sometimes we can confabulate neurodivergence with mainly conditions like autism, ADHD, so on and so forth. Where is the mental health field, in your opinion, in progressing away from that thinking? Have we
Mhm.
progressed well from that? Are we still back in the 90s, the 80s? Hopefully not.
Little bit. I mean, like, thank goodness homosexuality is not in the DSM anymore. Thank goodness that's not
Right,
pathologized as at least in the DSM anymore. I'm sure
right.
there are people who still consider it that way. So yeah, we're expanding there. There's a movement in the mental health world to start to move away from saying mental illness and saying mental health challenge or mental or lived experience. The language of that is changing a bit. I do often consult with therapists, agencies of psychiatrists or psychologists, or even larger mental health agencies through hospitals. And they are open, a lot of them, thank goodness, to hearing an alternative to the DSM, an alternative to the traditional models of diagnosing. And so there is a shift happening. The neurodiversity paradigm is in opposition to the pathology paradigm that we've already talked about. And so the idea that there is no one right way to be or to act or to learn or to love is
Right.
quite freeing, for people to hear. And I think whenever I present to therapists or doctors on this, they personally feel that resonates with them and they want that for their children. But it's hard to fight against the systems that are already in place to diagnose, to offer medication, to offer resources, insurance. So there's still quite a bit of work to be done. But I think philosophically, I'm seeing a shift. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I am happy to hear that there is that shift going on. I'm happy to hear that you're doing work involved in educating these providers of today and bringing your expertise to add to the treatment of people who are in this group. And one of my questions relates to how does our healthcare system miss signs of treating people who are neurodivergent better in communication with patients? I'm kind of curious with your consultant sessions, like what are the goals for you to speak with those providers and get them to understand? Is it mainly the language or is it mainly something else?
Yes, I have a bunch of thoughts in my head. One is I don't love the idea of treatment because that implies there's a cure, right? So if somebody wants to treat my autism, that implies that I want treatment or that I need treatment or I need
Okay.
fixing. Do you know what I mean? And so,
Yeah.
uh, so often there's a management of traits. I don't even use symptoms in many of these situations, but so sometimes like with ADHD, so I'm autistic and ADHD. I take medication for my ADHD and I definitely need to manage my ADHD traits um,
Yeah.
to do my work, to be an entrepreneur, right? To get up and be productive in my work. I do need
Right.
to manage. But we don't want to assume that somebody is challenged. Like this comes up in the disabled community as well. We don't want to assume that there's an impairment or a deficit or a problem because the person with their own agency and autonomy is the one to decide whether or not they want treatment, need treatment, if they think it's a problem in the first place, right? So sometimes we assume it's a problem if somebody identifies as, let's say, neurodivergent or disabled, but it's not necessarily, right? Even somebody bipolar, it's not
Yeah.
necessarily something anyone wants treatment for.
Yes, yes. I
Yeah.
think that that's probably something that you're laying the basis probably with some of these providers then, because
Mhm.
they're coming from that background of the DSM or the International Classification of Diseases is another
Mhm.
big book they use and viewing it from that way. But like you said, right, there's so many communities, the disabled community, the ADHD community, these communities who have spoken up and said, we're not interested, or people in that group, within those groups are not interested in having that label. And actually, to add to that, I think it's interesting when talking about intersex people as well, or people who are born intersex, because
Mhm.
when I just shadowed recently in a clinic at my institution, and it's interesting when parents come in and they're like, my child was born with this anatomy, or my child was born this way. What does that make them? Can we fix that?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
thinking about that language in itself, right? Before even getting to the broader conversation of gender identity and born sex, like sex assigned at birth, before even getting there, like thinking about like, well, how should we even view this condition, right? Like, is this
Mhm.
something that we want to fix? Is this something that even that term should be used?
Right.
And that's the tricky part. That's the tricky part about providing care. And I think that if you are passionate about listening to communities, then you would be the person to listen what they're saying. And if people are saying we don't want that label, we shouldn't use that label.
Yeah, that reminds me of, if you, let's say your child is intersex, your child is autistic, and the first thing you hear a provider say is, I'm so sorry. Like assuming assuming
Yeah.
it's a problem, assuming that the parent should be disappointed with, how
Yeah.
this human is. And then of course that affects how the parent sees the child and parents the child, and then that affects how the child sees themselves. And then if you bring that into the broader systems of, education, and the teachers and then the doctors and any of the providers or the therapists they see, and then they just start feeling like they've always been broken. But who determined that intersex or autism or schizophrenia or name it needs to be fixed? Who determined that there are problems in the first place, right? And so I
Mhm.
always want to work towards a place of, again, agency and autonomy and lived experience where the person gets to identify who they are and identify how they express their access and support needs and how they want to be perceived and talked about, instead of somebody projecting it on them.
Right, right, right. Emphasizing that, and you said it before, the strength-based approach,
Yeah.
and then emphasizing autonomy. Autonomy is
Yeah.
so important as we think about like an ethical principle, like people having autonomy over their minds and their bodies, but also the decisions that they make, right? And how are we empowering those decisions if we're pushing them one way or we're assuming when we walk in the room, right?
Yeah.
Those comments can be damaging. Those comments can
Yeah.
lead people who are neurodivergent, disabled, so on
Yeah.
and so forth, to not want to come to the provider's office or not want to come to see that person again. And that separation can affect them in other ways as well. And that is something that creates the rift between, I
Mhm.
believe, the queer community and healthcare is that
I agree.
mistrust that it can develop
Hmm.
and the lack of interest in wanting to go anywhere where they might be labeled as wanting to be treated.
I agree. Yeah. And as we're talking about medical care, I have yet to have a client in 30 years who has not experienced medical trauma in that way, where
Hmm.
they're either mischaracterized or they're perceived as being broken, or somebody is projecting, of course, their own stigma and biases onto them. And it's just unfortunate that there's a lot of overlap of medical trauma, certainly in the neurodivergent, queer, and disabled communities. And of course, I always say that if you're neurodiversity affirming, you need to also be gender affirming and LGBTQIA affirming, because the correlation is so strong in those communities, specifically with autism. 70% of autistic people identify as LGBTQIA plus. That's huge, right? So if somebody's out there
Right, right.
cheering for and supporting autistic people, they have to honestly be prepared, and I hope they are already LGBTQIA and gender affirming, but they have to be prepared to have those conversations.
Certainly. And you hit the nail on the head. I'm so happy to segue into then the next segment. Speaking of correlations or facts that we know about the neurodivergent and gender diverse communities, there's growing evidence suggesting that queer people tend to be neurodivergent, such as a 2018 study reporting 70% of autistic people identify as non-heterosexual, and 70% of gender diverse autistic individuals reported they want gender affirming care, but
Mhm.
32% of those individuals reported that their gender identity was questioned given their autism. One of
Mhm.
the most harmful experience to a patient can be not feeling listened to and feeling invalidated. This may be
Mhm.
especially true for these individuals. So, speaking of that connection,
Mhm.
I wanted to discuss what are your thoughts on the confabulation of those identities, autism, and then gender diversity,
Mhm.
and Is that something that you continue to hear about from people you speak with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And specifically autism right now. So not neurodivergent on the whole, but specifically right now with autism, I've seen those same statistics with 70% identifying as not straight or LGBTQIA plus, and then being questioned or challenged in their gender identity. That comes down to the stigma of people not understanding autism or presuming incompetency, presuming
Mm-hmm.
a lack of intelligence and self-awareness. And so I think that's where that comes from. I think that anytime somebody, and now I'm expanding it beyond autism, anytime somebody is
Mm-hmm.
positioned to already challenge neuronormativity, meaning society's idea of the right way, the in quotes, right or a normal ideal way to think or to learn or to act or behave. If you're already
Yeah.
positioned to challenge that or queer that or question that, you're positioned to also challenge and question and queer and diverge from other norms, such as heteronormativity and cisnormativity. So on top of that, the way a child in this in our society is trained to perform as a functioning member of our society. I'm saying a lot of this with sarcasm, but the performance that we're taught is not only
Right.
to be
Air quotes.
neurotypical, in quotes, all kinds of
Right.
quotes. If anybody can't see me, there's all
Yes.
kinds of quotes going
There's
everywhere.
all, yeah.
The,
Yeah.
I should say it. I wish there was like a tonality that I could bring to like saying something with quotes,
I'll
but
just
the
add some
performance.
music. Yeah. Go ahead. Go
Okay,
ahead.
on some like spooky horror music. The performance that we're trained in to be neurotypical is also a performance of being heterosexual and cisgender. Like it's like that's the
Yeah.
society's idea of what is a normal person, right? So
Yeah.
if you're already diverging from one, whether you're first diverged in gender fluidity or diverged in sexuality or diverged in neuronormativity, you're bound to challenge and diverge, at least in thinking, from the other. So a lot of people come out twice or many times over the course of their lifetime. But at the same time, many, many people come out as neurodivergent and gender fluid or queer at the same time or around the same time because you can't unravel one norm without starting to unravel the others. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Right. Right, right. I think that the confabulation again comes from the misunderstanding that one lies into one lies within the other,
Yeah.
and that placing this idea on someone that they can't separate the two, or that they don't have, I think, autonomy to, or like the ability, rather, I guess I would kind of word it, to view themselves as both these identities. And I
Mm-hmm.
think from what you said, that results in more assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
You've also explained, I've listened to how you've talked about a particular framework that can be taken, which is ask, affirm, advocate. Are you able to talk
The
about that a little bit
A.
here? I know that like they can just listen to your episode, and if you want to just drop your episode in, go ahead. But I think
Sure.
that's like really awesome that you have tried to make this conversation a little bit easier, so that we're
Mhm.
not entering the room assuming. Nobody enters the room, whether you're a provider, a family member, a friend.
Yeah, and thank you for saying the provider, family member, friend, because I think this applies to if you're a parent, the healthcare provider, if you're a therapist, if you're a coach, whatever, or friend. Yeah, ask the person you're talking to how they identify. Ask the person what pronouns they want you to use. Ask the person
Hmm.
what their access needs are, what their support needs are. So ask, and then implied in that is believe them, and then
Yeah.
affirm it in that, hear them, listen to them, believe them, and possibly even like mirror back so that they know you heard them, whether it's
Yeah.
respecting a pronoun or accommodating an access need. And then there's a lot of neurodiversity affirming therapists, let's say, out there or coaches, but like just affirming neurodiversity or affirming gender fluidity is great. But then what? Like, so then I added advocate. Like, we have to take action, right? We have
Yes.
to vote. We have to
Yeah.
advocate. We have to create new policies, rework, learn, unlearn. We have to, it's constant work. I wake up every day and think, oh goodness, I've learned something new. Now I have to write a whole new book or do a different podcast episode or rework a post I wrote, edit it. Like, this is a very new field, both neurodiversity and certainly neuroqueering, and the pathology paradigm being challenged is new. So I heard one day somebody said, we're building the bridge as we cross it. It's very dynamic and moving and active. And so in that learning, there has to be action and advocacy along the way. We can't just say, like, if you see an LGBTQIA friendly therapist or a trauma-informed therapist, like, great, but then what? Like, do they take action? You know what I mean? Sometimes it's just words. Sometimes it's just marketing. A lot of companies, 30% of Fortune 500 companies, have neurodiversity hiring practices. That sounds awesome. So any neurodivergent person is going to assume, oh, they're neurodiversity affirming, which means they must be also aware or advocate. It's not true. Often that means they want to attract, in that case, unfortunately, autistic people, which is exploitive in lots of ways I can go into if you want, but it's not really neurodiversity affirming for most companies. They're saying it, like companies that say we're inclusive, but then you get there and you're like, oh, but not if I'm coming in with mental health issues, for example, right? So you get the performative aspects of it. Right. And so that's why I say ask, affirm, advocate, because I really want the action. Here's all those A words again. I want the action to be in these frameworks, not just say you're LGBTQIA friendly. Like, that just doesn't do anything for anybody, you know?
Right. So many great things. With the advocacy part, I am a firm believer in, for us to move the needle, for us to achieve social justice for communities, we have to be involved. If we consider ourselves allies, or if we consider ourselves a part of the community, then we do have some due upon us to advocate, to vote, to be present and stand with people. I love that you gave that discussion just now as an ending. I've seen some of these before. I've seen like these kind of 3-lettered kind of approaches. They try to teach us in medical school, a bunch of them. And I'm like, I don't know. But I like this one in particular. I'm going to be honest with you, Pasha, because of that advocate, because of that emphasis on that part. And I think that as we move forward with being more inclusive about neurodivergence, being more inclusive about everybody who falls under that umbrella, making sure that we're having an expanded thought about who falls under that umbrella, that we also don't want to reel people in on a term, and we don't want to have hiring practices on neurodiversity that don't have actual meaning or good intention in them.
Absolutely.
And are on a website to attract, but not to advocate. So
yeah, which I think does more harm. If somebody is hired and now I'm part of an organization that I'm told is psychologically safe and a family and, you know, affirming, but then I get into meetings and I realize there's microaggressions and tons of stigma and bias, and I'm not actually going to be supported or elevated or promoted ever, then all of a sudden it feels worse. Because then it was like what do you call it? I'm so bad with idioms. Like where you're like, you got hooked into it, like hook, line, sinker. There's some term where you're like, you enter something thinking it's one thing and then it turns out to be another.
There's a term and I can't think of it.
There's a term. I don't know what the name is. And I'm with you. I don't like acronyms and like frameworks that are an acronym because I can't ever remember what the acronym stands for.
But that's fine. I might post this as a reel and be like, somebody comment what the comment is, what the saying is.
What's it called when you're, when you're told one thing, but then you get suckered into it and you find out it's another. Anyhow,
when I was reading about neuroqueer and getting into that term, and when I was reading about it, I couldn't help but think of the framework intersectionality.
Yeah, big time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? Very. And from what I'm hearing, it sounds like intersectionality underlies the strengths that neuroqueer people have, but also it was framed as how multiple identities can contribute to the oppression of people. So I also think of it as how our society places additional challenges based on the intersection of identities. But I'm curious for you, in your opinion, in what ways can the intersectionality of being neuroqueer serve as a strength for people?
Yeah. And somebody can be neuroqueer as an identity if they identify as neurodivergent and queer. However, it's not only for people who are neurodivergent and queer, because the idea of being neuroqueer is practicing neuroqueering, which is the queering and challenging of norms that we talked about. So anyone can be neuroqueer. Anyone can identify as
Yeah.
neuroqueer, and anyone can practice neuroqueering. So I love the expansiveness of it, for one. But as for the
Thank you. Yeah,
strengths,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, I think the strength is, let's say you do identify as neurodivergent and queer, you're now already positioned, you're challenging neuronormativity and cisnormativity and heteronormativity. And then on the wings of that is challenging racism and sexism and ableism. And so now I find the strength comes from the fact that once we start to unlearn, like then we realize almost everything we learned wasn't true.
Oh, God.
There's a right. Like it's kind of like, oh my gosh, like everything I learned isn't true. And so then you're unlearning your life and then you're reflecting. There's a moment of like sadness, frankly, and grief for not learning it before, or somebody not teaching you before, like what was actually going on. But then after that grief and anger period comes this huge empowerment and a big push towards justice sensitivity and advocacy work and being unmasked in our neuroqueerness and weirdness and uniqueness and really stepping into our power. I find that the neuroqueer and neurodivergent identities are used often by people who are advocates, who really are
Yeah.
not quiet about it. You know, they're either writing about it. I don't mean quiet in terms of our voices necessarily, but they're writing about it. They're creating
Yeah.
art around it. They're doing podcasts. They're becoming speakers. So that's the strength, I think, in it. You know, you can't unsee it when you see and understand to some extent ableism. For you can't unsee it, right? And so it changes our lens. And I found it empowering, even though in coming out neurodivergent and queer, I literally stepped away from a lot of power and privilege, and I lost a lot of people, and I lost a lot of opportunities, and I still do because of that identity. Like I mindfully, until I turned 50, did I feel like I had the strength to mindfully step away from a lot of that power and privilege. And I still have an enormous amount because I'm straight looking. I'm neurotypical looking. I can present, I can mask, I can hide all my weirdness pretty easily. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
fortunate in that way, right? I have that privilege. But the inside of me is like really fired up about how much of a false narrative I was fed in so many ways. Just me up. And that's good. Like anger fuels me, right?
Right, right. I mean, you're an entrepreneur. You got to have fuel.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not,
Entrepreneurs fuel the anger.
yeah, that's not something that could be easily done without some sort of passion. But
Yeah.
another thing, adding to the conversation, like how you said, the strength really does lie in being able to speak out, to do activities that are advocating, to participate and perform in that level. And I think it's interesting as well, kind of how you said, like that masking kind of part, like also that, like, because I've heard from people how they feel like they have to mask maybe some part of their identity. I've spoken with ADHD people who have talked about masking any sort of like hand mannerisms or any sort of like things that they typically do. And that's the part where if somebody is masking, then I'm thinking that person does not have any reason to feel like they shouldn't. There's something that's leading them to that. And so I guess what I'm saying is like, I hope that we can encourage these conversations a lot more and empower people who have these identities to feel more comfortable in simply being who they are, not having to mask, not having to hide. You mentioned the word come out, that word as well. Like, I think that there's so much language about that within the queer community, and then also from what it sounds about coming out as neurodivergent and just being mindful. Like, I think we have realizations in our lives, and I think that as part of those realizations, when we share with people, I mean, I watched the movie and it was like, I think it was Love, Simon, and when he told his parents he was gay, it was very much like, okay, like it wasn't this big deal. I wish we were all sort of around that framework of that. Yes, we are multiply capable people, and we can have coexisting identities, and that's really what adds to the strength. So, from what I'm hearing, yeah,
Yes. I do want to say that I would love to tell everybody to unapologetically unmask and be their authentic selves. And I do also recognize that there are many times we mask to be safe, or we mask to get a job, or we mask to
certainly,
keep a job, or we mask in certain parts. I'll mask my queerness in certain parts of the country where I know it's not as accepted. I'll also mask my neurodivergence or disability in a job application. We
yeah,
read the room. And so
true,
I think it's exhausting to mask. And ultimately, I think it will be better for people in the future when we don't have to mask so much. But I think we're in that kind of messy middle bridge area where we still are creating a culture where it's safe for people to be their authentic selves, you know?
certainly, safety first, safety first.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was listening to what you were talking about. Like, there's like psychological safety, there's like the physical safety, right? There's like multiple
Yeah.
aspects to that. So for sure. I have only a couple more questions left. I've really been enjoying this conversation. I'm learning so much. I think that I'm going to walk away from this conversation rethinking
Yeah.
the topics that I've even learned in medical school. Um,
Yep.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
The pathology paradigm and the medical model go hand in hand, just as the neurodiversity paradigm and the social model go hand in hand. One puts
yeah,
the blame and the responsibility on the person to get better or fix themselves or adapt. And the others, the ones that I lean towards, put the responsibility on society, on systems to adapt, to accommodate.
exactly, exactly. We talked a little bit about safety. I can imagine that
Mhm.
there are people who are listening in or exist in the world who understand that they have parts of themselves that they haven't quite explored that might be neurodivergent. They might feel a sense that they belong to both the neurodivergent and queer communities and don't necessarily feel supported or may be afraid to express themselves. So, in those situations, I'm kind of curious. You're working with people, I'm sure, who might be telling you that they are experiencing these thoughts and feelings. How do you approach those conversations? And do you have any considerations when speaking with people who are coming from environments where they're not supportive, if they live in a place where they don't really feel like they can openly unmask?
Yeah. In situations where my clients aren't safe unmasking their queerness or neurodivergence, I provide coaching and then guide them to some resources where there's a community, an online community, or even a book or resource that they can feel
Oh, okay.
at least safe and unmasking in the exploration of it with
Hmm.
somebody. But
Yeah,
then the
yeah.
other side of that, there's an imposter syndrome almost, if that's the right word, where they feel like, am I queer enough to identify as queer? Am I neurodivergent enough to identify as neurodivergent? Like a hesitancy to take on the identity, a hesitancy to use those words or those labels.
Okay.
And I hear this a lot, but people identify as bisexual, for example, or asexual, or for me, married, not to two men at the same time, but I have been married to two men. So I'm very hetero facing. I
Let's
had hetero.
clarify.
Yeah, yeah. That's a whole I had a hetero-facing lifestyle. So I was like, I didn't feel totally comfortable coming out as queer in the hetero-facing relationships
Uh-huh.
because I knew I was, but nobody
Hmm.
could see it or tell. And my lifestyle didn't. So there's just all these nuances. Likewise with neurodivergence, if somebody comes out as neurodivergent, they know that many people in society will equate that with autism, and they know that autism still is stigmatized, right? So
Right.
not the society doesn't yet understand that neurodivergent means like 300 plus possible neurotypes, you know?
Hmm.
And so there's a hesitancy to step into the identity for that. And then finally, there's a hesitancy to step into it because they want to be valid and do it justice. I don't know if that's the right word, but like they don't want to diminish. Like when I use pronouns she, they, and identify as gender nonconforming and gender fluid, there was a part of me that was worried to use she, they pronouns because I don't want to ever diminish the experience or journey of a person, right? Or somebody who uses they, them pronouns. So I'm like, am I allowed to use she, they? Like I really questioned it. And so I had a sex therapist actually, who I worked with, who worked with the queer community, who helped me, say, well, why do you identify with these pronouns? What resonates with you about it? Is that your truth? And allowed me to step into that with some more clarity and purpose. But so I love having those conversations that are expansive, that there's no rules. Like we can be really fluid and expansive in these conversations. So for somebody, back to your question, who's identifying but doesn't feel safe talking about it, whether it's me or another neurodiversity and gender affirming coach or therapist, I think that would be a good start. As well as I think a couple books that I always recommend. One is Neuroqueering Heresies by Dr. Nick Walker. And the other one, newer, is called by Sunny Jane Wise, We Are All Neurodiverse, and Unmasking Autism as well. And, those are the three books that I just love for people to read when they're stepping into this expansiveness.
Right. And the resources, I think, can be one of the first aspects of engaging with this discussion that somebody who might identify right with those communities might interact with is their first kind of experience, whether it's reading, whether it's speaking with a coach or a consultant or anyone like that, rather than I can imagine for some people it's opposite. Maybe they like grow up in a place that's like super open about talking about neurodivergence and being neuroqueer. Whatever city in America that is, I don't know. But
there. It's funny when you come out, there's a funny joke that's something along the lines of at least when you come out as queer to your family, you're not outing your entire family tree. And the reason why that's funny is because when you come out neurodivergent, specifically if you're talking about something genetic like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, you are outing many people in your family tree, whether going up and down the family tree. So there's this feeling of like, oh, if I come out autistic, I know my father's autistic. I know this with he doesn't know he's autistic. He doesn't want to talk about autism. I know one of my children is autistic. They don't want to identify as such. That's fine. That's their prerogative. But like in me disclosing my identity, it did open them up to some vulnerability as well. Yeah. Whereas with queerness, I don't think that's as much necessarily the case, but anyhow, that would be a whole different conversation.
Yeah, I think, opening up the vulnerability. Also, like this imposter syndrome thing. When you started talking about that, I was like, I have felt that before about something. I was like, like I actually have felt that before. And now I'm like trying to think like, why, like, can I be a part of this? Can I use this? I think maybe when I was first identifying with my transness and non-binary self and trying to figure out those identities, I was like, where does that fit? And am I allowed to do this if I'm not this way? And battling those internal conversations and thinking about like, where does that come from? Like, how do we get to this place where we're judging ourselves and not accepting our truth rather? So I appreciate that you've added that. Yeah. I guess one of the last things I want to add is we talked about the destigmatization and taking out the pathologization. I see I messed up. That was my...
Yep, that was great.
I knew there was one time I couldn't say the whole word, but I'm going to try again.
Pathologization, I know.
Yes. It's not that early. I've enjoyed this conversation. I want to say, do we still need the DSM-5? Is that something that like you've been thinking about? Just thinking about for like so many conditions, even going to like bipolar.
Yeah.
I have a close friend of mine who is bipolar and neurodivergent, and just thinking about communities that we've been describing for disorder for so long, like, do we still need this big book?
Yeah. I would love to say, let's just throw it away or burn it. However, at the moment, it still offers the diagnoses that leads to the diagnostic codes, that leads to somebody getting care, that leads to somebody getting insurance coverage, that leads to somebody getting medication. So I just think we're in this place where, yes, and, our current systems are situated where they rely on the DSM and those diagnoses. And
True.
what if all these systems determine that that's not the way we're going to do it anymore? Like, that would be great, right? And if we could, for example, not require a diagnosis to get accommodations for disability at work, that would be an amazing step in the right direction. Or if somebody needs, for example, more remote work or flexible work, but the organization is waiting for them to come back with like a doctor's note that says they're autistic, but the wait is a year, the cost is $3,000. That's not, there's privilege wrapped up in the diagnosis there. And so it's not attainable, it's not sustainable. And so I think the direction we're going is away from the DSM being the only way and formal diagnoses, and leaning more towards lived experience, and then believing people, like believing people and not needing a doctor's note. I mean, like as if all the doctors are 100% correct. No, that's not true. And so, yes, I do think at the current moment, the DSM is still serving a purpose, but I love to challenge the people who are using the DSM to expand their own thoughts and beliefs and language. Like even when you said bipolar, the fact that you say bipolar instead of bipolar disorder to your friend is just so huge. Like it changes everything, right? And so even if the therapist said, and this is what I do with my clients. I say, if I need to use a diagnostic code, I'm going to say, unfortunately, these codes are labeled this way. This is not how I perceive it. This is not how I would language it. This is not how I identify you. This is not how I think about you. This is the system we're working in to get you the insurance, to get you 10 more sessions or whatever. And so it's a conversation, which is much more empowering. And again, back to agency, like it lets the person know, kind of see behind the veil, like what, know what's going on, know that they have a choice as to whether or not they want to have that diagnostic code be used. They could choose not to. And that's why I work as a coach now, because I don't have to do that. I don't have to give people diagnoses. I don't have to use a code. Unfortunately, I'm not insurance based. So there's that. Like a lot of people can't afford my services, because insurance doesn't cover codes yet. So there's much work to be.
But that's the thing. Yet, like, are we moving towards a place where we can provide services like this? We can encourage without stigmatizing, where we can provide space without making it feel like it has to be a purely white walls, medical space, lonely chair, and sink in the corner, right? Like
the first insurance company that covers coaching and holistic medical care, I'm like, I will invest in that company.
Wow.
Right?
It's that important to you.
Yeah. With whatever money I have.
I have to say, I mean, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I don't want to get emotional, but I think that it's very beautiful that you're affirming so many people. And it just makes me think of people in my life who I've interacted with, I really love. And yeah, I don't think I've ever really cried at the end of a show, but or had a little teary moment. But it's that important. It's vital. And it's personal. Yes, of course. Oh, look, I got just a little tears. But thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much, Pasha. I really want this to uplift everybody who's listening in to start feeling empowered at first to rethink and to understand that, again, as human beings, we're not monoliths, and that we come from a multitude of experience, even starting like in the womb, right? Like we are being shaped, and how that contributes to who we are today. And it's just beautiful how we evolve. And I'm so glad that neurodivergence, queering, having neuroqueering thoughts, or like neuroqueering as a verb, I'm trying to get it right, can challenge how we've been thinking about how communities should be. And I'm so ready for your teachings to be at the helm of what is being taught, like at an institution or at a coaching session, anywhere really, when it comes to this topic, because it's so important. So please people, please listen to Pasha's podcast, at least a little bit.
She's higher, Pasha. Yes. I do love talking to organizations and institutions about creating cultures of neuroinclusion, about the pathology paradigm, the neurodiversity paradigm, and expansive language around it, but also coaching if there's neurodivergent and or queer people out there listening that just need a coach, need some support. I work with couples a lot too, neurodivergent and queer couples. So that's work that I do as a coach. And I have to say, I've done, I don't know, hundreds, maybe, I don't even know how many hundreds of episodes. And of all these episodes, like, you are by far the most prepared and thoughtful and comprehensive podcast host I've ever encountered. Like, it's just extraordinary. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And your colorful wall and the enlightenment. This has been a favorite. So at this time, I am going to end the recording. If it's one aspect of this talk I'm taking away, neurodiversity does not equal neurodivergence, does not equal neuroqueering. We are all living in neurodiversity. Our minds make it so. Pasha has done an excellent job teaching on the realities and misconceptions behind neurodivergence, and furthermore, how we can harness the power of neuroqueering to critique the world around us. These are topics I didn't learn in school, but I'm so glad I am now. Many queer individuals feel an affinity towards neurodivergence or have explored that in some way prior to discovering their sexuality, and vice versa. We know that the two are not tied. Although there are associations in the literature, we have no causal tie between the two, and we shouldn't assume so. That being said, it's important for us to challenge the medical community that continues to pathologize the etiology of neurodivergence, such as that appears in ADHD or autistic people, as conditions, when actually to many they are identities. Furthermore, gender and sexuality should not be tied to these identities. Once we accept diversity as enriching and not limiting, we can support more LGBTQ+ people as their true selves without placing more shame and discrimination in an already stigmatizing healthcare system. Thank you for listening in. If you would like to listen to more about Pasha's enriching discussions on neuroqueering and more, please visit her show titled Neuroqueering, Beyond the Intersection of Neurodiversity and Queerness, wherever you like to stream. You can find references for our conversation in this episode's biography. Let's push the conversation more on Instagram at Equerity Podcast, Twitter/X at Equerity Pod, or on TikTok at BEQ Pod. Full video podcast episodes are posted on YouTube, which is also linked in the bio, or you can type the Equerity Podcast in the search bar. If you liked what you heard today, please give the show a quick star rating, follow and/or subscribe on your preferred listening platform. Take care and see you in the next episode.